The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the second day of this October 2023 7-day session at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And there's something that I'd like to share with you, and that is that about the forms of Rinzai Zen Buddhism, because every religion has forms, and some of them are quite similar. To start with, the Rochester Zen Center, which was my original 20 years of training, was nominally Soto. In Japan, Zen is divided into Soto and Rinzai sects. The Soto sect is one that has come down from Dogen, Kigen, and the Rinzai sect is one that has come down from Linshi Yishuan, who was in China. Dogen was Japanese, went to China, had a deep awakening, and came back and started teaching a deeper form of Zen. And he's considered the father of Soto Zen in Japan. The Chinese forms for Buddhism are different, as are many of the other forms, just like any regional differences in churches or temples, or any other place of practice throughout the world. And this Rochester's nominally Soto because Dayan Sogaku Mitra-roshi, although he was a Soto monk, he was ordained in the Soto sect. He was not happy with the level of training, the depth of training that was available in his era in Japan, in the Soto sect. And so he did many, many years of practice in Rinzai temples in Japan, extended practice. There is some question that he was actually authorized to teach in at least one of the Rinzai temples. That's been argued. I'm not quite sure what the details are, and it doesn't really matter. And so he taught with the form of a sort of split between Soto and Rinzai. And that's what Rochester inherited. And because Roshi Keplo had trained with him and then also with his successor, Yasutani-roshi. So they did the Soto form in terms of sitting facing the wall, but they did the Rinzai form in terms of a much faster kinhin. Soto kinhins are extremely slow, basically a breath, sometimes a breath per step, or even a breath for the first part of a step, and the second part of the step was the second breath. Extremely slow. And in fact, when you practice in a Soto temple, you don't ever get back to your seat when you're doing the Soto kinhin, which is the walking meditation. In Rinzai, you go around and around and around and around, much faster pace. It ranges between walking as if you're walking down the street fairly briskly, or even faster than that. And it's an energetic kinhin, meant to help you focus in the midst of activity. The Soto kinhin, being so slow, emphasizes the focus and the presence. Now, focus and presence is important in all of Zen practice, and really in any spiritual practice. It doesn't matter what the name of it is or the history of it. And so we sit the Rinzai form, and that is because after I spent my 20 years in Rochester, I went on to Sogenji to train further at Sogenji in Okayama, Japan, under Mitra-roshi, and there it is straight Rinzai. One of the things about Daiyun Sokaku Mitra-roshi, and Harada, by the way, is a very common name in Japan. In fact, there are or have been at least 4 contemporary Mitra-roshis that I know of. And I think all of them are, no, I think the one that inherited Hoshinji is still alive, and of course, Mitra-roshi is still alive, but Daiyun Sokaku Mitra-roshi and Tangen Mitra-roshi are both, they both passed on. So in Rochester, you sit facing the wall. You sit for 35-minute rounds, and you receive it's called a kyosaku, the encouragement stick is what it's called, on acupuncture points on your back, up near your neck, on a soft, fleshy part near your neck. Meant to encourage, meant to help you bring your energy down if it's gone up, and assist you in deepening your practice. And it's used quite a bit in Rochester, and fairly effectively. The challenge is that when someone is hit with a stick, if there's anyone in the zendo or the person who's been hit with a stick who has experienced any form of brutality, any trauma involving physical trauma, it can trigger those people. And so we initially started using the keisaku, as it's called in Rinzai Japanese, and quit using it because in Rinzai it's even more triggering because you are struck from the front. It's also much more complex. In the Soto form, you just receive the the kyosaku, and then you gasho, thank you, afterwards. But that's all the form there is around it. In Rinzai, you stop, you bow to the person who's bringing the keisaku in front of you, and then you take off your rakusu, and you go down, hold your hand on one shoulder where they give you a whap on the other shoulder, actually 2 whaps, unless it's winter and you're having a heavier robe, and then it's 4. And then you go down on the other side, and you put your rakusu back on and bow. So it's quite complicated, and it can be distracting for some people. At Sogenji, the only person who is allowed to give the keisaku without request is the roshi. Senior people in the zendo carry the keisaku also, but they can only give it in response to a request, which is a gasho, and unless a person is sleeping, and then they're allowed to give it to somebody who's sleeping because it can help wake them up, help bring up energy or bring down energy, either way, whatever is required. So that's one of the differences, and they sit facing each other across the room. In the Soto sect, when the prostrations are done, and in a minute a little bit more about prostrations, they're done towards the altar. On the altar is usually a figure of Manjusri, who is considered the Bodhisattva of wisdom, the emanation, well, not emanation, but an expression of the transcendental wisdom, the prajna wisdom, that is also innate in everyone and can be open to and realized through zazen. And he is carrying a sword because he's considered the one who carries the sword that cuts delusions. Now, that's a metaphor, of course. Nobody's going to get sliced with a sword. Or sometimes there's a Buddha figure on the altar. And that brings up another subject, because every major religion that I'm aware of, whether it is Christianity, Judaism, Islam, or Buddhism, has an injunction against bowing down before idols. And when the Soto folks do their prostrations in front of the Buddha, it can smack of bowing down before an idol. And it can also give the impression that the Buddha is worshipped, which is far from the truth. Although sometimes when people are simply bowing down in front of the Buddha on the altar, they can maybe think that they're worshiping the Buddha. The Buddha is nothing to be worshipped, because the Buddha really means our innate perfection, our innate compassion and wisdom, and the figure is up there as inspiration to help us focus on our practice, remind us what we're practicing for. On our altar, we have a figure of Koan, the Bodhisattva of compassion, which is a representation, you can see her back there, of compassion, which is also innate in us. Compassion and wisdom are two important aspects. If you have wisdom and no compassion, which is kind of hard for me to conceive if it's really prajna wisdom, if it's really transcendental wisdom, but then you're not complete. If you have compassion but not wisdom, then it's also going to lead you in superficial directions. So we have here at Mountain Gate the expression of compassion on our altar to remind us that each of us has that innate quality within us. Every human being does. And more than that, animals, many animals, I would say all animals have that compassion built in as well. If you look at Boo, he has our wonderful big dog here. It's very clear he's compassionate. And the little one, Sophie, again, expresses it as well. So one of the things that is known these days in particular is that dogs, and especially, can be can help people feel grounded, can help people feel protected, can help engender relaxation. Beyond that, if they're particularly trained, they can be alert to when someone is about to have a stroke. They can be alert to when somebody is, if blood sugar is too high and could end up in a diabetic coma. They're trained to be alert to when somebody might have a heart attack or be on the way to having a heart attack. And so they can, through their presence, prevent that. It's amazing how perceptive animals are. So definitely here at Mountain Gate, we are not bowing before any idols. We do our prostrations across the Zendo to each other as a means of honoring the true nature, the perfection, the innate compassion and wisdom of each one of us. And when I bow before the Koan on the altar, I'm also doing the same thing. So it is a big misunderstanding in some places what the bowing, what the prostrations mean. Traditionally, through the Japanese system, prostrations are done in series of 3, and sometimes series of 9. When I was at Sogenji, I was, the whole time I was there, I was, my koan really, I mean, my underlying koan, I was working on koans, of course, there, but a separate koan, because I knew I would be coming back and teaching, was whether to sit facing into the room, which has great advantage. Buddhist practice is meant to be 24/7, really. It's meant to bring us to a full, compassionate, wise life free of attachments. Attachments are usually born of conditioning, and they create an inner sense of how we are, who we are, and often have us living in a box, a very narrow box, where certain circumstances cause us anxiety or fear, other circumstances cause us anguish or a sense of loss, other circumstances create happiness, and of course we're always chasing the positive and trying to avoid or get rid of the negative, which can't be done, actually. What we can do is learn to let go of our attachments to having it a particular way. And that is immensely freeing. This thing about preferences, wanting things to be nice. Of course, everybody wants things to be nice and happy. Wants things to be such that they're at ease, and doesn't want things to be such that they're frightened or anxious or unhappy or sad. And yet the two go together. If you are closed down to an emotion, a feeling, you cannot open yourself to other feelings. I learned that the hard way. It really limits the functioning of your mind. When I was in Sogenji, not in Sogenji, when I was in Sesshin in Mexico City with Roshi Keplo, I'd been training with him. I was near the end of my training, and I was working on koans. Of course, by the way, there are a gazillion koans. That's part of the Rinzai system. And normally I could pass koans rather quickly. And so I'm in the sesshin, and I'm not passing the koan. And finally, on the third day, Roshi says, I don't know what's going on, but normally you would have passed this by now. And I suddenly realized what was going on. Circumstances prior to sesshin had brought up a lot of anger. It had hit some conditioning in my earlier life, and so I was stuffing it so as not to feel it. And because I couldn't feel the anger, it was still there, and it had put up a wall between me and feeling anything else, me and allowing myself to access my intuitive sense, which is how you work on koans. You don't work on koans intellectually. There's a deep, wordless understanding that can become clear with a koan. And so once I allowed myself to feel the rage, I was able to pass the koan quickly. And that's when I realized that you cannot shut down part of your mind and have the rest of it function fully. It's just impossible. So those are some of the differences between Rinzai and Soto, and this is Japanese Zen. Chinese Chan, which is Zen in Chinese, Zen, by the way, means meditation. Zazen means seated meditation. And the Chinese system is different. The forms are different. The clothing is different. For some reason, the Japanese have hung on to the Chinese, ancient Chinese form of the robes of a monk, whereas the Chinese have moved on and their robes are much simpler. But I think our robes hail back to the Sung dynasty, when Chinese monks were coming to Japan to teach, and when Japanese monks began going to Japan, as Dogen did, and his teacher also did, to learn from Chinese monks. That's how Zen got transmitted into China and into Japan. Beyond that, every temple and every teacher teaches out of their own experience. And for example, now the Rochester Zen Center, Bowden Kolheed, who is my Dharma brother, has retired, and his successors, two of them, share the heading of the Rochester Zen Center. Donna Koal, who is ordained, and I don't remember her ordained name, and John Pauline. And they have very different personalities from Bowden. And Bowden, of course, is much closer to the traditional way of teaching that Roshi Kapleau had inherited from his own training in Japan. And so the flavor of the Rochester Zen Center has shifted. And so there are always going to be some people that really can relate to that new flavor, and some people who are not as able to. And so there's usually a change in the population of any Zen center when there's a change in teachers. The only way we can teach is through our own experience. This is different from many other religions in which there's a specific set of protocols, a specific form for teaching, so that everybody fits into that particular form. It may be that the homilies, the lectures, the whatever you want to call them, the teachings, spoken teachings of the teacher are a little bit different, but usually they're pretty close to the dogma, I guess I would call it, of that religion. The reason for this is that in Rinzai Zen, the transmission, as it's called, although nothing is transmitted, is based on the experience, depth of awakening of the person transmitted to. It's a mind-to-mind transmission. And so it is essential in Rinzai for people to have had a Kensho experience deep enough, and also that their behavior is in line with what they've realized in order to continue the lineage down. Here at Mountain Gate, we recite two different lineages of teachers, and one of them is the Soto lineage that ends with Roshi Kapleau. One is the Rinzai lineage that ends with Yamada Mumon Roshi, who was Harada Roshi's teacher. And this is a way of remembering the efforts and the dedication of all the people, going all the way back to the Buddha, who practiced seriously with commitment, with determination, and were able to open their minds, let go enough that they experienced enough freedom, enough degree of freedom, that they could act in theoretically ethical, compassionate ways. Now, unfortunately, that's been abused to a certain degree, and we saw that in the United States with a couple of Japanese Zen teachers. When Mitra-roshi was asked about that, as well as some American teachers as well, he said they didn't spend a long enough time in the monastery. In other words, their training was not complete. This is why the long maturation is so vital here at Mountain Gate and in Rinzai Zen in general. Because having a kensho is not sufficient. You have to then live what you've realized. And it's too easy, if it wasn't very deep, for example, to just shove anything that comes back into consciousness, insights into your past behavior, for example, that were not particularly stellar, that may have been dysfunctional, may have been harmful, and they're uncomfortable to feel. So if you're committed to the long maturation, you're going to open to recognition of those things. Feel deeply the remorse, the concern, and the determination not to act that way anymore. And gradually, you're clearing out your history. It's a very, very important aspect of Zen. Kensho makes it possible to go deeply into that, but it's not sufficient if you don't, if you choose not to, if you choose to shove it under the carpet. And so it's very, very important to do serious practice and to really allow yourself to see clearly what ordinarily you don't want to see, and so it's kind of buried, and work with it to free yourself from the attachment that created it in the beginning. So that's pretty much the form of Rinzai Zen. There are slight variations depending on the temple and the teacher, but basically, if you have practiced in one Rinzai temple, generally you can go to another and know what's going to happen and follow along. Soto is not that different. Unfortunately, officially, the Soto sect decided that it was not necessary to have had a kensho in order to teach. They decided that in the early 1900s, apparently, and so it puts people at a disadvantage training in Soto sect. This is why we are committed to the Rinzai sect, because we're committed to very deep, transformative practice. The Soto teachers that I know are very lovely people, kind, generous. They try hard to be the best people they can be, but they're a little bit hamstrung because they don't have that urging to go beyond the ordinary mind states that the Rinzai sect has. So if we want to be truly free, the potential is there, but the potential means allowing yourself to open to where you have shut down awareness of behavior that you might have been ashamed of or was uncomfortable, and particularly people who have been traumatized. No one wants to feel that again for very clear reasons. But a certain amount of that has to be processed in order to be free of the caught places that it creates. anyone who has experienced trauma, it's vital that they also do effective psychotherapy. Otherwise, it just, like I say, you're boxed in. You're limited in how deep you can go in the Zen practice. And that's unfortunate because you can become immensely free so that things are not a problem. And it's not like people assume that when you've had a deep enough kensho and done the work that you just won't have difficult things happening anymore. That's not the case. It's when you have difficult things happening anymore, they don't jerk you about. You're able to still remain clear and able to see effective ways to work with it. And the anguish that would ordinarily accompany it, or the anger that would ordinarily accompany it, are not, they're not there. They may come up extremely briefly, but we also know exactly how to work with that and dissolve it so that it is not an issue. So this, in a nutshell, is our Zen practice. Rinzai sect works on koans, as I said. And the koans are worked through in a particular way where there's a series of collections of koans. You start with a breakthrough koan, and there are several that are effective. The classic one is the mu, in which case it goes back to a monk asking Joshu, who was a very deeply enlightened master in China, does a dog have the Buddha nature? Does even a dog? And to understand that, you have to recognize that dogs in Asia in general are usually considered pretty dirty critters. When I was living in Burma, nobody had pet dogs. The dogs were called pai dogs. I'm not quite sure why. And they were wild. And they scavenged. And when anyone was sick in a village, they would put offerings out at the outskirts of the village, and the dogs would eat them. It wasn't intended that the dogs were eating them. That was not the point. The point was an offering, and the dogs happened to have some handy food available. They just were essentially wild dogs. They were not considered very nice to have around. They were often dirty. They were often full of disease. And it wasn't at all like your nice little puppy dog in the United States or one of the Western countries. So that's where the monk was coming from. He had this idea that the Buddha nature was this ethereal, blissful situation, and that something that nasty or unpleasant couldn't possibly have the Buddha nature. And Joshu said, no, it doesn't have the Buddha nature, which is not the truth, but it is the truth. And here we get into form is emptiness and emptiness is form, because another monk had asked Joshu the same question, and he had said, yes, a dog does have the Buddha nature. So how can a dog have the Buddha nature and not have the Buddha nature at the same time? Well, it is possible. And so that's the conundrum. How is it possible? And you chew on that for however long it takes, often years. I know someone it took decades before they had any kind of kensho with that koan. It's not a koan that is normally as effective in the West, from my perspective, simply because our view of puppy dogs is, Boo and Sophie, really sweet animals, unless you've been bitten by a dog, and who would think that they didn't have the Buddha nature. Then another koan that Hakuin was very fond of was, what is the sound of one hand? We know that's the sound of two hands. How can one hand make a sound by itself? So that's another one. The one that I favor is your face before your parents were born. And the backstory of that one is when the sixth patriarch, who was a layman, and not only that, he was an uneducated layman from the south, which was considered a barbarian area in China. And it was because his father, who had been a government official, high enough that he rankled somebody or other and was exiled to this barbarian area, had married a local woman who was illiterate and died when their son was 3 years old. Now, ordinarily, the father would have started teaching a child right around that age how to do kanji, how to read and write kanji. And by the time they were 4 or 5, they might even have been reading some classic Chinese literature. But he died before that could happen. So Huineng never got that advantage. And of course, in those days, there was no insurance. And so his mother took him out into the forest, and together they picked up branches and twigs and gathered them into bundles and sold them as firewood in the village so that they would have some money to eat with. And when Huineng was 19 years old, he was carrying a load of firewood to a client and heard an itinerant pilgrim reciting the Diamond Sutra. And when it came to the phrase, arouse the mind that abides nowhere, not on thought, not on ideas, not on reactivity, arouse the mind that abides nowhere. He had a very, very deep enlightened experience and asked about where that had come from, and was told that the fifth patriarch's temple, the fifth patriarch was encouraging his monks and his students to recite that, to learn it and recite it. And at that point, one of the clients offered Huineng enough money that he could support his mom without having to go and get firewood, without her having to go get firewood. So he was free to go to the fifth patriarch's temple, which was quite a long way in the north of China. And of course, he was going on foot. We don't know how long it took him, months perhaps, to get there. In the meantime, he's probably deepening that insight, just pondering it, but just opening more and more deeply. And so he was at the fifth patriarch's temple, out in the back area where the lay people were. Lay people in these temples were normally supporting the temple, supporting the monks in the temple by providing food, raising food, taking care of all the nitty-gritty stuff. And the monks were in the zendo doing zazen. So he was assigned to hull rice. And actually the little pit and the, I guess it's the mortar. I don't know which is the mortar and which is the pestle. Anyway, they're both there still, even though this was a long, long time ago, centuries ago in China. And that's what he did for 8 months. But his first encounter with the fifth patriarch was remarkable. And the fifth patriarch recognized that he had opened to a great depth. When he went to meet the fifth patriarch to be allowed into the temple, he was asked, "Why are you here?" And he said, "To become Buddha." Buddha means awakening, awakened, enlightened. And And the fifth patriarch, testing him, said, "What do you mean? You're some bum from the south. You're a hick. You're a what do you know? You can't even read." And Huineng responded, "The Buddha nature knows no north or south." And that was a very deep answer. And so the fifth patriarch recognized that this kid had something really important. And so he sent him out back. And then eventually, after 8 months, he went to see him and tapped a code, basically, because the monks would be jealous. Back in ancient China and also in Japan, but the history of Zen in China is quite a bit longer than that in Japan. And monks would go, people would go into the monastery to escape legal procedures. So often there would be crooks, robbers, murderers go into the monastery. And these monasteries were exceedingly large, 3,000, 2,000 monks, some of them actually with quite a bit of wealth and owned land and owned slaves. I mean, this is not your average picture of a monk in ancient China, but that is the truth of what it was like. It finally got to a point where the government, recognizing this, required that anybody who got ordained have to have 3 cones of incense burned on top of their head as part of the ceremony. And you can tell anyone who's been through the ceremony because they've got these little, slightly smaller than dime-shaped burn marks, burn scars on the top of their head. He figured, the government figured that, somebody who was having legal issues would not want to go through that. I don't know if it's successful or not, but that's what was happening. So the fifth patriarch recognized there was also an event with regard to poems, because the fifth patriarch was getting older and was seeking a successor. And so he asked the monks to write on a wall that was going to be painted with a mural, a poem that would express their depth of understanding. And so the rest of the monks were shy to do that because they thought, well, the head monk is going to get it, so we don't need to write it. And the head monk wrote a poem that was partly there, and when Huineng saw it, he said, this is not the full story. And he asked a government official to write his poem, which was considerably deeper. And then the other monks were gathering around and admiring Huineng's poem. And the fifth patriarch came along, concerned for Huineng's safety, rubbed it out and said, don't pay attention to this one, but memorize the head monk's poem, because it was on its way. And so he called Huineng into his room at midnight and asked him if he needed any clarification. And so he clarified, and then he gave him the robe and the bowl that signified the transmission of the teaching down from the Buddha. Huineng was the last person to get that robe and that bowl because it was considered way too dangerous. An earlier ancestor who actually it was the sixth patriarch, embalmed and then lacquered. You can still see his lacquered body on an altar in that temple. And somebody jealously tried to cut off the head. It wasn't successful, but you have to understand that people that come into monasteries come in because they've got stuff. We wouldn't be bothered to try to search out any kind of freedom from difficulty if we didn't have any difficulty. And so people can come into a monastery and think everybody is just angelic, but it's not so. Everybody's working on themselves, which is primary and most admirable. So the sixth patriarch, the new sixth patriarch, took the robe and the bowl, crossed the river, and went through the forest on his way to the south. And the monks in the morning wondered why the fifth patriarch wasn't out and about, and he said, because the robe and the bowl has gone to the south. And they figured out who it was who had gone and taken it, and figured he'd stolen it. And so they took chase. And there was one monk who had been a general, supposedly, Monk Myo, in his earlier life, and could track very readily. And he was the one that caught up with the sixth patriarch first. The sixth patriarch, realizing someone is about to appear, put the robe and the bowl on a rock and then went behind a bush. And the monk, seeing the robe and the bowl, went to pick it up, and he couldn't lift it. So there was something going on in his mind, some doubt about whether it really had been stolen or whether it had been given legitimately. Otherwise, he would have been able to lift that thing up. Anyway, he breaks into a cold sweat and says, lay brother, I didn't come for the robe and the bowl, I came for the teaching. So Huineng came out from behind the bush and said, okay, I will teach you, but first we're going to do some zazen. So they sat zazen together for a bit, and then the sixth patriarch said to him, when you were pursuing me, thinking of neither good nor evil, where then was your original face? The face before your parents were born. And at that, Monk Myo was enlightened. And there's more to the story, but that's not relevant in terms of the koan. So all of us has an original face. All of us is an original face. And all of us can realize that original face. But it takes a lot of chewing on to get there. Then the last koan is, who am I? And basically all the other koans really are a search for that. Many of us come to Zen practice wondering who we really are. And it's a wonderful koan because it's contemporary, and it doesn't require any twists of history. So those are the breakthrough koans, they're called. And you work on that for however long, and it can be years and years and years and decades until you have a deep enough insight. You'll get little insights all along the way, but a deep enough insight that it would be called a kensho. And then you can start working on what they call subsequent koans. And there, like I say, technically there are 1,780 subsequent koans. Each lineage has a different count. And they're meant to broaden and deepen that initial kensho. And a certain number of them are required to be passed before one can become a teacher, along with the other requirements, prerequisites. So that's about it for background information on on the Rinzai sect and on Mountain Gate's form. Initially, when we sit facing each other in the Zendo, it's a distraction. If you're facing the wall, you can make your own distractions. But if you're sitting facing in the Zendo, there are other people around that you have in your field of vision, and thoughts can come up and respond to those people's presence and all kinds of things. And so it gives you a chance to really work on being present in the midst of whatever kind of environment you're in, which is really important in terms of ultimate freedom that we can experience through our Zen practice. So I think I might actually have gone over. Oh, yes, I'm sorry. So I'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.